Evidence has been uncovered that a man who had a UFO encounter gained superhuman powers. Think X-Men. So strong, in fact, that he could actually dissolve matter with thought.
He thinks to himself, wouldn't it be cool if I could melt the ceiling over my bed? And there it was. He was astonished to see himself looking through the ceiling into the clear stars outside. He was looking through his drywall ceiling, the insulation, the plywood roofing, the shingles, the whole bit.
This superhuman transformation took place in August of 1991. It was about 4 p.m., and Bob and his wife had just passed through Chesterfield, Illinois, on Route 111. They were driving through cornfields when Bob's wife noticed this bright red object low into the left, skimming just above the corn tops. Well, she pointed it out, and Bob glanced over. This object was traveling parallel to the car, so Bob instinctively eased off the gas to eliminate the possibility that it was deliberately keeping pace with the car. But when he did, the object slowed down as well, so Bob sped back up, and it sped back up. Well, they ran through this eerie dance 2 or 3 times until Bob realized that, yes, indeed, it was in fact keeping pace with their car. Eerie, right? Well, he pulled over and he stopped. His wife, anxious, said, "Bob, please don't get out of the car." But he did. He stepped out on the blacktop, crossed the road, and he just kept puzzling over this thing. It wasn't like a UFO way up in the sky. No, it was hovering just above the corn tops. At first, it looked as if it was just sitting out there in the cornfield. But after a moment, he realized that no, it was slowly moving toward him.
As the object starts getting really close and looming overhead, he sort of unconsciously backpedals a little bit, and he is completely fascinated on this object that's hovering about 10 feet. It stops and holds a hover about 10 feet above his head.
Bob said that it was so close that had it been just a tad bit closer, he might have been able to jump up and touch it.
It was holding its hover, but it was also kind of sort of slowly rotating a little bit.
Bob had been a flight director for the United States Navy, working on the deck of the USS Ranger, so he was pretty good at gauging dimensions.
He said the craft was about 100 feet wide. It was about 30 feet tall. It was metal unibody construction, all one piece of solid metal. There were no seams, there were no rivets, panels, bolts, screws, or markings of any type.
Bob said that it was triangle-shaped with a ribbed, semi-transparent dome on the top.
The dome was at various times pink or bright red. It was bright red anytime the craft moved horizontally, and when it was hovering or idling, it was pink. So it almost, he felt like when it would power it up, it would go from pink to red.
And even though this thing was hovering like one, it definitely wasn't a drone. There was no air shooting down from the bottom. There was no sound at all, actually, just this eerie, silent, powerful thing floating above him. Each corner of the craft had something that looked kind of like an intake, or maybe an exhaust.
So as he's doing his walk around of the sides, or the perimeter walk around, he said at one point one of those ports aimed directly at him, so he immediately went into his instinctive flight deck crouch. And I asked Bob, I said, so what was it? Was it an intake or an exhaust? And he goes, well, neither in terms of conventional terms. He said there was no air moving through there whatsoever, but you could see a heat shimmer if you look down the tunnel.
Bob spent about 20 minutes or so looking this thing over, or at least, so he thought.
Welcome to Vel Arcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
Bob's wife had first spotted this triangular-shaped object around 4 p.m., and not long after that, it was hovering right above Bob's head as he carefully studied it. According to Bob, this took about a half an hour at the most. That's why it was so confusing when suddenly it was dusk. Twilight was bleeding across the horizon when Bob looked around and he noticed a second craft approaching from the west, gliding low over the corn. Well, it slowed and then stopped about 50 feet away from the first. Bob was overwhelmed, but he was also super intrigued. and his first thought was actually to stay and see what happens. But then something strange took place. He was hit with this overpowering feeling, clear, urgent, and impossible to ignore. Get into your car and go straight home. This wasn't Bob's thought. No, it was something that had been injected into his mind. And even though he wanted to just brush it off, he wasn't able to. So he obeyed. He got back into his car and they drove home. And that was the entire extent of Bob's UFO encounter. And had that been all there was to this case, well, it most certainly would not have made it onto this channel. But it wasn't. No, there was a lot more to this case. Once Bob got home, he tried to make sense of that missing time, but he just couldn't. And over the next few days, he began to develop a deeper sense of everything around him, as if the world had suddenly come into some sharper focus, as if he were seeing just below the surface of reality. Ordinary objects and people started looking very different to Bob. And before long, well, he began seeing flashes of events that hadn't even happened yet. In the days that followed that strange afternoon on Highway 111, Bob felt different, very different. He moved through the world with a sharper edge, a deeper sense of everything around him, as if he could feel the matrix behind reality. Colors seemed more vivid. The voices of people who he passed carried a new weight. And then the flashes began. They came in broad daylight while he was wide awake. Sudden, vivid glimpses. 5 seconds here, 2 seconds there. Glimpses of bad things. Bad things that were happening to people that he knew and people that he didn't. One day, he looked at a coworker and he saw the man's dog being hit by a car. Another time, he glanced at a woman in the break room and he watched as she lost her job in a way that would shatter anyone. These visions were clear, precise, and completely uninvited. At first, Bob kept his mouth shut. He just tried to brush it off. He told himself that it had to be stress, probably brought about by seeing that strange object in the sky and then having to deal with that missing time. Oh, but the visions, they just kept coming, and then every few weeks, he would get the news. That dog, it actually did get hit by a car. And that woman, indeed, she had been fired, and she was falling apart exactly as the flash had shown.
It crossed the line from a UFO sighting into the realm of the paranormal.
After 6 or 8 of these incidences, Bob could no longer stay silent. Whatever this was, well, it came with a moral obligation. If he could see the bad things that were going to happen to people, well, then he had an obligation to warn them. One of those moments happened at work. His coworker, Tom, was heading out to his pickup truck at the end of the day when Bob got one of those flashes. It only lasted for a couple of seconds, but Bob could clearly see Tom's truck going out of control, then flipping upside down and landing in a ditch with Tom's legs pinned underneath. So Bob approached Tom, asked him if Bob could drive him home. Well, this of course confused Tom, who pointed and asked, "Why? There's my truck, right here. I'm going to take my truck home." Bob, not wanting to look crazy, tried to convince Tom without telling him exactly why he wanted him to ride with him. But eventually he gave in and he said, "If you drive home tonight, Tom, you're going to get into a wreck." Well, at that, Tom got annoyed, even a little angry. "Look, I'm tired," he said. "Just leave me alone." And then he climbed into his truck and drove off. The next morning, the phone rang. Tom was in the hospital. He had indeed been tired, so tired, in fact, that he had fallen asleep at the wheel, crossed the center line, clipped another oncoming car, then spun across the road, and the truck flipped over into a ditch, exactly as Bob had foreseen. Both of his legs were pinned beneath the truck and broken in 8 places. Well, Bob drove straight to the hospital, and as he was walking down the hallway approaching Tom's room, he could already hear Tom telling his wife the whole story, the warning, the exact details, how he had brushed it off. When Bob stepped through the door, Tom looked up, his eyes were wide, and he said words that still echo in Bob's memory. He said, "Bob, I'm going to listen to you, everything that you have to say for the rest of my life." Part of the evidence in this case came from this event. Timothy Aines, the assistant director for the experience and research team at MUFON, investigated this case. and he was able to confirm this part of the story directly with Tom himself.
I found Tom, the gentleman in the pickup truck. I interviewed him. Tom confirmed Bob's story of the pickup truck accident completely. And he said to this day, he still listens to anything that Bob has to tell him.
Seeing into the future wasn't the only extraordinary ability that Bob developed after encountering that craft. In fact, it was just the tip of the iceberg. He discovered another ability one day while he was outside working on his above-ground swimming pool. Bob's backyard was completely fenced in with this gate that made a loud, distinctive clacking sound whenever anyone entered. Well, that afternoon, Bob was working alone at the base of a ladder that led into his above-ground swimming pool. He glanced up and he saw a teenage boy at the top of the ladder getting ready to jump into the pool. Bob, of course, was startled, but perhaps more interestingly so was the boy. Bob later said that the boy's expression was, "Uh-oh, he can see me." Well, Bob took just a fraction of a second to set his tools down so that he could stand up and get a better understanding of exactly what was happening. But in the tiny amount of time that it took for him to do that, the teenager was gone, and the ladder was empty. But the eeriest part came just a few days later. See, Bob's son had a friend who had died in a motorcycle accident, and at the funeral home, Bob walked in to pay his respects. And there on display were two photographs. One was of the recently deceased motorcycle victim, but the other was of another son that the family had lost just a few months earlier, a boy who had died on a train trestle in a crazy game of I Dare You that turned fatal. The photo of that boy was, now, check this out, an exact match of the teenager who Bob had seen standing on his ladder just a few days earlier. Well, Bob realized in that moment that his abilities weren't just limited to seeing the future. No, sometimes he could see people who had already died but hadn't quite moved on. Bob had been given powers that he'd never asked for, strange abilities that seemed to redefine physics. But nothing, not the flashes of the future, nor these visitors from the past, could have prepared him for what was coming next. Because soon, Bob would discover that he also had this crazy power where he could completely rearrange and then dissolve matter. Two years had passed since that afternoon on Highway 111, but the strange new abilities inside of Bob had never quieted down. It was the 1990s and psychic fairs were everywhere. Colorful tints, palm readers, tarot card readers, and always, tucked in a corner somewhere, was a person with an old Polaroid camera promising to photograph your chakra or your aura. Well, Bob and his wife saw the signs for one and decided on a whim to get theirs done. Nothing serious, just for fun. Well, they stepped inside and Bob's photo was taken. A second later, it emerged from the big clunky Polaroid printer. What happened next was strange. The technician looked down at it, grabbed it, and then said out loud, "Oh, wow." He immediately handed the picture to the psychic in the next booth. "Hey, George, oh my God, look at this." Well, George took it and he said, "Holy cow." Well, the photo started making the rounds. From psychic to psychic, booth to booth, the entire room started buzzing. Well, Bob stood there, growing more annoyed by the second. It was his photo, and he still hadn't seen it yet. Finally, he spoke up, voice teetering on irritation. "Hey, do you think maybe the customer could possibly see his own photo, please?" Well, the psychics all stopped, and they said they were sorry, but they had never seen a photo quite like this one. Bob's aura was all bright red. They told him that, based on what they were seeing, he was the strongest psychic in the room, way stronger than any of them. Then one of the psychics said that his powers were so strong, in fact, that if he wanted to, he could probably manipulate matter itself. What? That's impossible. No, she said that he probably could do it, but it might be a little bit easier if he started with something simple, like manipulating clouds. She explained that he could go outside, pick a cloud, Not the whole thing, maybe just a small portion, and then using nothing but the power of his thoughts, generate a tunnel of heat that bores straight through the water vapor. Once he could do that on a regular basis, she said that he'd probably be ready to work on something more solid. Well, this sounded more like fairy tales than reality to Bob. So he took his photo, stuffed it into his pocket, and then walked out of the fair, feeling embarrassed and more than a little unsettled. And he never did try to manipulate the clouds. But after a few weeks, with the psychic's words echoing in the back of his mind, he decided that, well, one night he would give it a try. So one quiet night, as he was laying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought, how nice would it be if I could see the stars? So he redirected his attention, focusing on the idea of seeing straight through the ceiling and into the night sky. He calmed his mind and then focused with everything that he had. At first, nothing. Then, in an area of the ceiling, in the corner of the room, a small patch of black smoke began to form. It swirled, thickened, and then slowly shaped itself into a perfect ring. The ring grew darker, wider, deeper, while Bob sat up, his heart beating faster. Then, a fine white mist began pouring through the opening like a gentle waterfall of light. He stood up, walked over, and looked straight up. There it was, an actual hole in the ceiling. He could see the night sky clearly, the stars glittering exactly as he knew they would be. Drywall, insulation, plywood, roofing, shingles, everything in this area of the house had simply vanished. No mess, no damage, just perfect circular window out into the universe. For one frozen moment, Bob stared upward, astonished and terrified at the exact same time. He had done exactly what the psychic said that he could do. And then a fear hit him like a ton of bricks. He backed away immediately, laid back down on his bed, and then he forced his mind to go blank. After a couple moments, the black ring began to shrink. The white mist faded, and the hole closed over on itself until the ceiling looked exactly as it had before, smooth, solid, and untouched. Bob lay there in the dark, breathing hard, and he made a solemn vow right then and there. This would be the first and the very last time that he ever used this power. In their interview, Timothy Aines asked him why.
He said, well, if that's what I could do to my ceiling in my bedroom, what if I get involved in a road rage incident and somebody makes me angry? You know, there's potential for doing harm here, or who knows what.
Bob had proven that the psychic from the fair was right about his abilities in the most dramatic and intimate way possible. And even though he swore that he would never use those abilities again, he would soon discover that there was something else. Something that, at least to Bob, proved that the human experience isn't just limited to just one life. One quiet night, Bob was overcome with a feeling, and he spoke a question out loud to the universe. Who was I in a previous life? Well, almost immediately, a vivid vision flooded his mind, and he saw himself as a woman who had lived about 100 years ago. Her name was Gertrude Barron Walker. Then he saw the town, Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and a White House overlooking a river. The details were so clear and so certain that Bob couldn't shake the feeling. He had never been to Poplar Bluff in his life, but the next day off he couldn't resist, and he made the drive out. The moment that he entered the town, somehow he suddenly seemed to know all the streets, and he made his turns without hesitation, and eventually he pulled up directly in front of the house, the same exact house that he had seen in his vision. Well, he sat there staring with his heart pounding. Could this really be a place that I lived in a different life? Well, still not fully convinced, he went to the local records office. Sure enough, the documents were unmistakable. A woman named Gertrude Barron Walker had indeed lived at that very house from 1877 to 1918. On his way out of town, Bob drove past the house one last time. He stopped the car and he got out. As he stood there, looking at it, he was hit by another vision. This one was of his own death as Gertrude. Creepy, right? well, he saw himself, or I guess herself, collapse in the grass about 50 yards from the front door. As life was slipping away, he watched the town's blacksmith ride up on his horse. The blacksmith noticed the fallen woman and then got down from his horse and ran straight toward her to help. Just as the blacksmith was approaching, the vision faded to darkness. Timothy Aines verified several pieces of Bob's story. As we shared earlier, he located Tom, the coworker from the truck accident, and interviewed him directly. Tom confirmed every detail, right down to the 8 broken bones in his leg. Timothy also confirmed the teenage boy that Bob saw on his ladder. He was indeed a real boy who had died exactly as described. And Gertrude Barron Walker? Well, he looked into that as well, and she was indeed a real person who lived and died in Poplar Bluff, Missouri in 1918, just as Bob had seen. Bob's wife also pointed out parts of the story. She told Timothy that they had indeed encountered that UFO, and that the incident at the fair with the Chakra photo had taken place just as Bob had described. Her strong religious views, however, made the entire subject very difficult for her, and Timothy respected that boundary. Now, you guys know that I'm the skeptic, but the one thing that did grab me about this case was that Bob himself sought nothing from anyone for his story. No interviews, no book deals, no personal gain at all. He even waited 30 years before sharing this story with anyone, and he told Timothy that it was extremely important to him that he be kept completely anonymous.
His case was a legitimate case where it absolutely was worth the effort and justified delving into the paranormal a bit.
I'm sure that there are many people out there who would just dismiss this case outright. Memory can play tricks. Coincidence can often seem like destiny. Some might even suggest that that glowing red triangle Bob encountered on Highway 111 was nothing more mysterious than an experimental aircraft slipping out of the nearby Whiteman Air Force Base under the cover of twilight. The patterns in Triangle Alley, the similar sightings reported before and after, all of it could fit neatly inside of the known boundaries of classified technological and human suggestion. But according to Timothy, every verifiable name, every date, every independent witness, it all checked out exactly as Bob had described. Tom's accident, the train trestle boy, Gertrude Barron Walker, all of them were real, confirmed by records and by people who had absolutely no reason to lie. And as I said earlier, I was impressed by the fact that Bob sought nothing for the telling. Supposedly, he still lives with this gift he never wanted, but he was finally able to lock it away forever. And the most powerful part of this entire story, I think, is that one starry night when Bob, an ordinary man, stared up at his ceiling and with nothing more than just the power of thought, willed the matter in his roof to dissolve. A second later, he was gazing at the stars. If that really happened, well, then that's insane. And it provokes all kinds of questions, right? I mean, come on. Really? Was that moment real? Who are we to say it wasn't? Well, then, was the power real? Is the power real? I don't know. Maybe the question shouldn't be, is the power real? Was the power real? Maybe the question really should be whether or not any of us would have that courage to do the exact same thing that Bob did. Lock that power away, throw away the key, and never open that door again.
Stories like this are easy to dismiss at first. I mean, on the surface, it sounds unbelievable. But Timothy Aines didn't just listen to Bob's story and leave it at that. No, he spent time investigating it. He tracked down witnesses, confirmed records, and verified key parts of what Bob described. Much of the same things I do here at Valorcana. Now, I spent a lot of time talking with Timothy about his work at MUFON, and he said there's this location in Illinois that researchers call Triangle Alley, a region that is known for repeated sightings of unidentified triangular craft. And Bob's UFO encounter fell directly in that area. And like Damon said, Bob didn't share his story to become famous. He didn't even want attention. He only came forward because he thought it was important enough to share with the world. Take that, along with the documentation, Well, that's a big part of why I think this case is worth taking seriously. And speaking of seriously, if you'd like to help us keep digging into cases like this, following the threads, tracking down the details, and uncovering the stories that don't quite fit, please consider supporting us on Buy Me a Coffee. We seriously appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this video, check out one of the others on the screen.